August 1851, the government of the colony of Victoria began charging a man 30 shillings a month for permission to dig a hole in the ground. 30 shillings whether he struck gold, 30 shillings whether he struck clay, 30 shillings whether he spent the whole month at the bottom of a wet shaft 80 feet down and came up at the end of it with nothing but the mud on his own arms. Within 3 years, the population of the colony had gone from about 77,000 people to more than 230,000, most of them men, most of them on the diggings, and the government had put mounted police out across the fields twice a week to check that every one of them was carrying a paid receipt. Today, Ballarat is the largest inland city in Victoria, with something over 100,000 people living on top of it, and it looks like a prosperous provincial town with unusually wide streets. What happened there in the middle of the 1850s did not happen at any of the other fields, and the reason was not the men and it was not the license. It was what lay underneath. Chapter 1. The rivers that stopped running. Start a very long time before anyone was there to see it. The rock under central Victoria is old seafloor mud, laid down in flat sheets, then squeezed, folded and shoved upward into a range of hills. As it was squeezed, hot water moved through the cracks in it and left behind quartz, and in some of that quartz it left gold. Then the weather went to work. Rain and frost and time took the tops off those hills, and broke the quartz apart and washed the pieces downhill into streams, and the streams did what streams do with heavy things. They carried the light material away and let the gold sink. It settled on the bedrock floor of each channel in the deepest line of the current, packed into gravel and clay a few feet thick. The miners would come to call that line the gutter, and finding it would become the whole of the work. Then Victoria caught fire from underneath, beginning a few million years ago and continuing in places almost into human memory. Volcanoes opened across the western plains and poured out basalt. The lava did not spread evenly. It ran downhill because lava does, and downhill meant the river valleys. It filled them, cooled, and sealed them shut, and the rivers that had been running in them either died or were pushed sideways into new courses. Over the ages that followed, the soft country either side of the buried valleys wore down while the hard basalt cap did not, so that the land turned itself inside out. The old valley floors ended up as ridges. The richest ground in the district finished up lying under 50, 100, sometimes 200 feet of clay, sand, drift, and rock, with nothing on the surface to say it was there. Geologists call those buried channels deep leads. There is no polite way to say what that meant for a man with a shovel. At the goldfields of New South Wales and at Forest Creek and Bendigo to the north, a great deal of the gold sat in creek beds and shallow gullies where a man could wash it out of a pan in the open air and walk to the next bend when the ground failed him. At Ballarat, the surface gold was a thin skin over the top of the real thing. And the real thing was underground, in the dark, in the beds of rivers that had stopped running before there were people on the continent. The people on the continent had been there for a long time regardless. The country around the site is Wadawurrung land, part of the wider Kulin grouping, and the name Ballarat is generally taken from local words meaning something like a resting place, though the derivation has been argued over for a century and a half. Then came sheep. In 1838, a squatter named Archibald Uele took up a run on the creek there and put a station beside a shallow reed swamp, and for the next 13 years the place was a pastoral lease with a few thousand sheep on it and a name that appeared on almost no maps. The swamp is now a lake in the middle of the city. Victoria separated from New South Wales and became a colony in its own right on the 1st of July 1851, and within days it had a problem it had not planned for. Gold had already been found at Clunes. In early August, a man named Thomas Hiscock found it at Buninyong, about 10 miles south of Uele's Run, and the news went to Geelong and Melbourne in a week. At the end of that month, a small party working a gully on the Yarrawee Creek near the station found gold on the surface in quantity at a spot they named Poverty Point because they had expected nothing there. The men usually credited are John Dunlop and James Regan. The gully beside them became Golden Point, and by the middle of September there were about 1,000 men on the ground. For a few weeks it was the easiest gold in the world. The stuff at Golden Point lay within a few feet of the grass, coarse and heavy, and men who had never held a cradle in their lives took out in an afternoon what they had earned in a season. And then, quite quickly, it was gone, and the only way left was down. Chapter 2. 30 shillings a month. Charles Joseph Latrobe was the Lieutenant Governor of Victoria, a cultivated and cautious man who had come out to superintend a quiet pastoral district and was now watching it come apart. He had no army. He had a police force that was resigning to go digging. He had public servants walking off their jobs, ships lying in Hobson's Bay with no crews aboard because the crews had gone up country, and a treasury that would not survive a year of it. The Crown owned the gold in the ground by law, and Latrobe reached for the only instrument he could think of that would produce revenue immediately, and, he hoped, slow the rush at the same time. On the 16th of August 1851, the government announced a gold mining license. From the 1st of September, any man digging for gold in Victoria had to hold one. It cost 30 shillings a month, £1.10, payable in advance. It gave him the right to work a small piece of ground and nothing else. It was not a tax on gold. It was not a share of what he found. It was a charge for the act of digging, levied on the whole rather than on what came out of it. And a man who spent 4 months sinking through wet clay and struck barren bottom paid exactly the same £6 as the man beside him who struck the gutter in a fortnight and retired. It was, in a colony of 77,000 people, a genuinely enormous sum to ask of a labouring man every 4 weeks, and the government knew it. In December 1851, Latrobe went further and proposed raising the fee to £3 a month. The response arrived faster than the mail could carry it. On December 15th, 1851, the diggers of Forest Creek held a meeting in the open on the Mount Alexander field, and the crowd was estimated as high as 20,000 men, which was a substantial fraction of every adult male in the colony. It has been known ever since as the Monster Meeting. The government withdrew the increase within days. That should have been the lesson. The lesson the administration took instead was that the fee itself was tolerable, since the men had only objected to doubling it, and so the 30 shillings stayed, and the machinery for collecting it grew. Commissioners were appointed to each field with the power to settle claim disputes and issue licenses. Police were sent to check them. The commissioners built themselves a camp on high ground above each diggings, with a stockade around the gold receiving office, and at Ballarat that camp sat on the rise where Lydiard Street now runs, looking down over the whole field, and the field was worth looking at. By 1853, Ballarat was not a camp, but a landscape of holes, spread over several square miles of country that had been sheep-run 2 years earlier. It had its own geography and its own names, and the names came from whatever had happened there first. Golden Point, where Dunlop and Regan had washed the first dishes, Canadian Gully, where a party of North Americans had gone down, Black Hill, a mass of quartz-bearing rock on the northern edge that would eventually be quarried out of existence entirely, Red Hill, Eureka, the gravel pits, Specimen Gully, Sailor's Gully, Prince Regent Gully. And on the eastern side of the Yarrawee, between the flat and the higher ground, an unremarkable rise with a baker's tent on it. Bakery Hill. It was not a landmark, and nobody wrote it up. It was a slope of trodden dirt with tents and windlasses and washing gear on it, and a track running over the top, and the only thing that distinguished it from 100 other rises on the diggings was that a man could buy bread there. The tents multiplied through 1852 and 1853, and so did the shafts, and the shafts got deeper every month, and the men going down them began to notice something about the arithmetic. The license was charged by the month. Ballarat was a field where the work took months. Chapter 3. Sinking. A claim on the Victorian goldfields in the early years was 8 feet square. That is a piece of ground smaller than a modern bedroom. And on a shallow field it was a reasonable allowance, because a man could work it out in days and peg another one. At Ballarat, the same 8 feet was the mouth of a mine. The work went like this. 2, 3, or 4 men went into partnership, because one man cannot sink a shaft alone. Somebody has to be at the top turning the windlass, while somebody else is at the bottom filling the bucket. They cut through the topsoil and into clay. Below the clay came drift, sand and gravel in layers that had been laid down over the buried valley, and every so often a hard band that raised hopes and delivered nothing, which the diggers called a false bottom. They cribbed the sides with slabs of split timber as they went, because the walls of a shaft in wet ground do not stay where you put them, and a man working under unsupported clay at 60 feet is working under a ceiling that is deciding when to come down. They kept going until they hit bedrock, and then they drove sideways along the bedrock looking for the gutter. Everything depended on where the gutter ran, and nothing on the surface indicated where it ran. The ancient stream had been perhaps a few yards wide at its richest, and it wound. 2 parties could sink adjacent shafts, 100 feet each, 3 months of work each, and one of them would come out with a fortune, and the other with wet clay. Water was the constant enemy of the deep leads. It sat in the sand above the bedrock under pressure, and when a shaft broke into it, the shaft became a well, and men bailed in shifts around the clock to keep their hole from filling faster than they could empty it. Consider what that did to a man's accounts. Every month of sinking cost him 30 shillings for the license before he bought a shovel, a rope, a bucket, a slab of timber, or a bag of flour carted in from Melbourne over roads that were mud for half the year. 4 months down and nothing found meant £6 paid to a government that had done nothing for him but sell him permission. 6 months meant 9. The men who complained about the license at Ballarat were rarely complaining about the money in the abstract. They were complaining that the fee was designed for a field where a man could pan a creek, take his chance in a week, and move on, and that Ballarat was not that field, and that the government had never adjusted the instrument to the ground. Ballarat rewarded the gamble often enough to keep everyone at it. In 1853, the parties working Canadian Gully brought up several very large nuggets within a few weeks of each other, and the news of it went round the world and pulled another wave of men off ships at Melbourne. The deeper the leads went, the more spectacular the results when a party hit the run of gold in the gutter, because the deep ground had never been touched by any previous rush, and the concentration in the wash dirt was extraordinary. It also began to change who could dig at all. Sinking a 100-foot shaft through water-bearing ground needs timber, a good windlass, pumping gear, and enough men to work in shifts, and it needs all of that paid for before a single ounce comes up. So the parties got bigger. 4 men became 8. 8 became a company with shares in it. The independent digger with a pick and a tin dish. The figure the whole rush had been built on in the popular imagination was already becoming an anachronism at Ballarat by 1854, and the men on the ground knew it before anyone in Melbourne did. What Melbourne knew was that the licence revenue was falling. In June 1854, a new governor landed to do something about it. Chapter 4. The Hunt. Sir Charles Hotham was a naval officer, a captain who had commanded on the coast of Africa and led a diplomatic mission to the River Parana, and he arrived in Victoria in June 1854 to considerable public goodwill. He toured the diggings with his wife and was cheered on them. Then he went through the colony's books and found a deficit, and found that gold license revenue had fallen well below what the number of men on the fields implied it should be, and drew the obvious conclusion. In September 1854, he ordered that licenses be checked twice a week on every field in the colony. At Ballarat, by the best estimates available to his own officials, more than half the men digging were not holding a current one. The check was called a license hunt, and the name was not invented by the diggers as a slur. It was what it looked like. Mounted police and foot police went out across the field in a line, and the cry went up ahead of them from tent to tent and windlass to windlass. And men ran. Some ran into the scrub, some went down their own shafts and pulled the rope after them, and there are accounts of troopers standing at the mouth of a hole waiting for a man to come up for air. A digger who could not produce the paper was liable to a fine of £5, which was more than 3 months of license money and more than most men had. If he could not pay it, he was taken. Taken where is the part that mattered. The lockup at the Ballarat camp was a slab building of limited capacity, and when it filled, men were chained. They were fastened by the wrist or the ankle to a log lying in the open ground of the camp enclosure, in whatever weather the Victorian Highlands were providing, until the Commissioner could deal with them. A man might be chained there because his license was in his tent a mile away. He might be chained there because the paper had gone to pulp in his pocket, which happened constantly, because he spent his working life standing in water. The system also paid a share of each fine to the man who made the arrest, which is a design that produces the behavior you would expect it to produce, and complaints of extortion and of straightforward bribe-taking by police and by commissioners were continuous through 1854. The other thing happening in that year does not appear in the political correspondence at all, because it was routine. The ground was killing people. A deep lead shaft is a hole 100 feet deep, 3 feet across at the collar, held open by split slabs wedged against saturated clay, with men climbing it on a rope. Walls came in and buried men at the face. Buckets came off hooks and fell the length of the shaft onto whoever was below. Ropes parted. Windlass handles ran away from the man holding them and threw him over the top. Water broke through from an abandoned working next door and filled a drive in minutes in the dark at the far end of a tunnel with one exit. Foul air collected at the bottom of shafts that had been left standing and killed the first man down. There was no inspectorate, no compensation, and in most cases, no inquest worth the name. The Ballarat Old Cemetery filled steadily through the 1850s with men in their 20s and 30s whose headstones, where there are headstones, record that they were killed in a claim. That was the actual cost of the ground at Ballarat. Months of labour, several pounds paid in advance for the privilege, a genuine chance of drowning in the dark, and a mounted policeman coming over the rise twice a week to ask for the receipt. On the evening of Friday, 6th October, 1854, a Scottish digger walked up the hill from the Eureka lead toward a hotel that stood on the corner, wanting a drink after closing time. Chapter 5. The Hotel and the League. His name was James Scobie. The hotel was the Eureka, a large and profitable place kept by a former convict from Van Diemen's Land named James Bentley. Scobie and a companion hammered on the door and were refused. There was an argument, and in the early hours of 7th October, Scobie was struck down outside and died of it. Bentley was arrested and brought before a bench of magistrates at Ballarat on the 12th of October, and the bench acquitted him. One of the magistrates who sat on that bench, John Dews, was later removed from office for corruption, and the digger's view at the time was that Bentley had bought the verdict, which is a view the subsequent history of the case did nothing to weaken. 10 days later, on October 17th, 1854, about 10,000 men assembled on the ground outside the Eureka Hotel. Speeches were made. Stones went through the windows. Then the building was set alight, and it burned to the ground in front of the police, who were too few to stop it and did not try very hard. A second inquiry was ordered into Scobie's death, and Bentley and 2 others were eventually convicted of manslaughter in Melbourne, which gave the diggers the satisfaction of being proved right, and did nothing whatever to cool the field, because in the meantime 3 men had been arrested for the burning and jailed for it. There was more. That same month, a trooper had gone into the tent of a Catholic priest at Ballarat, Father Patrick Smith, looking for licenses, and Smith's servant had been beaten and arrested. On a field where a very large proportion of the diggers were Irish, this was not a minor administrative incident. The grievances were stacking. A fee that punished deep sinking, a police force that hunted men twice a week and took a cut of the fines, a bench that acquitted a publican who had killed a digger, and a government in Melbourne that answered petitions with troops. A delegation went down to see Hotham on behalf of the 3 jailed men. It was made up of John Basson Humphrey, George Black, and Thomas Kennedy. Hotham received them and refused to release the prisoners, on the ground that he would not be dictated to by a deputation. The delegation came back up the road to Ballarat with that answer. On November 11th, 1854, more than 10,000 men met on Bakery Hill. The slope with the baker's tent on it was the only piece of open ground on the eastern side of the diggings large enough to hold them, and it was central, and the meeting formed there because of that and for no other reason. Out of it came the Ballarat Reform League, with Humphrey as its chairman. Humphrey was a Welshman from Newtown in Montgomeryshire, a Chartist, and he had brought the whole apparatus of English radical politics halfway around the world in his head. What the League demanded was not gold, and it was not a lower fee. It demanded full and fair representation of the people. It demanded manhood suffrage. It demanded the abolition of the property qualification for members of the Legislative Council, so that a man without land could stand. And it demanded payment of members, so that a man without money could serve. These were the points of the People's Charter, transplanted onto a Victorian goldfield, and the League's resolution stated plainly that taxation without representation was tyranny. Humphrey believed in moral force. He believed the Charter would be won by petition, argument, and the press, and he said so repeatedly. Hotham, reading the resolutions in Melbourne, concluded that a body demanding representation on those terms was preparing to separate the goldfields from the colony, and he began moving soldiers up the road to Ballarat. Chapter 6. The Oath. Through the last days of November, the reinforcements came in from Melbourne, detachments of the 12th and 40th Regiments marching up the road past the diggings in full view of every man on them. On the 28th of November, a column arriving at Ballarat was harassed and stoned as it came through, baggage was overturned, and a drummer boy was hurt. The following day, November 29th, 1854, about 10,000 men met again on Bakery Hill. Something was flown over that meeting that had not been flown before. It was a flag of dark blue with a white cross on it and 5 white stars set on the arms and centre of the cross, the Southern Cross, the constellation every one of those men had been sleeping under for years. It carried no Union Jack in the corner. That absence was the entire statement, and everybody present understood it. It was not the flag of a colony. It was not the flag of a company or a district or a trade. It was the flag of something that did not yet exist, and it was sewn by hand out of wool and cotton, reportedly by women on the field. And it was, at that moment, an enormous piece of blue cloth on a pole on a low rise on the outskirts of a mining camp. Under it, a man climbed onto a stump. Peter Lalore was 27, born in 1827 at Raheen in Queen's County in Ireland, the son of a member of Parliament and the brother of a revolutionary, trained as a civil engineer, and he had worked on railway construction in Ireland before sailing for Victoria in 1852. He had been on the Ovens field and then at Ballarat, where he held an interest in a claim on the Eureka lead. He was not one of the League's officers, and he had not led anything. He put to the crowd an oath, and men knelt on the dirt of Bakery Hill with their hats off and their right hands up and swore by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and to fight to defend their rights and liberties. It took a few seconds to say. Around 1,000 of them, by most accounts, went on to act on it. The next morning, 30 November, the authorities ran a license hunt at the gravel pits. Given the state of the field, the decision is difficult to read as anything other than deliberate. Stones were thrown, the riot act was read, shots were fired, and arrests were made, and the men who had sworn the oath the day before went back to Bakery Hill, and then they moved. They went across to the Eureka lead, to ground that was theirs in the sense that they worked it, and they began to build. What they built was made of the diggings. The stockade at Eureka was roughly 100 feet by 200 feet, about an acre of ground, thrown up over about 2 days out of pit slabs and overturned carts. The pit slabs are the detail worth holding onto. Those were the split timbers cut for cribbing the sides of shafts. The wood, whose entire purpose was to hold the deep leads open so men could work in them. They pulled it out of the ground and stood it up on end to make a wall. Blacksmiths on the field forged pikeheads and fitted them to poles for the men who had no firearms. Among them was Raffaello Carboni, an Italian from Urbino who had come to Victoria in 1852, spoke several languages, and served as the point of contact for the German, Italian, and French diggers on the field. He would write the only full eyewitness account of what followed, published a year later. There were Irish, English, Scots, Welsh, Germans, Italians, Americans, Canadians, and Prussians inside the enclosure, and there was no plan beyond holding it. And then, over Saturday, December 2nd, the enclosure emptied. Men went back to their tents for food. Some went to look for arms that never came. Some had families a mile away. By the small hours of Sunday morning, the number inside was somewhere between 120 and 150. Layla's own later account gave roughly 70 men with firearms, 30 with pikes, and 30 with pistols. At about 3 o'clock that morning, at the government camp on the hill above Lydiard Street, 276 men formed up in the dark. Chapter 7, Dawn, December 3rd. The force was commanded by Captain John Thomas of the 40th Regiment. It consisted of 87 foot and 30 mounted men of the 40th, 65 men of the 12th, 70 mounted police, and 24 foot police. They went out before first light on a Sunday, which was the day the field would be least prepared and least populated, and they came at the stockade from the higher ground, mounted men swinging wide on both flanks to cut off the retreat toward the tents. The sentry saw them at around 4:30, and the alarm went up inside. The first shots were exchanged at a distance of perhaps 150 yards. The soldiers came on in line, fired volleys into the enclosure, and then went in over the slabs with the bayonet, while the mounted police took the open ground behind. The men inside fired what they had, which in most cases was one barrel, and then had nothing to reload with. The pikemen went forward against infantry with fixed bayonets and cavalry in the open. It lasted a matter of minutes. Most accounts put the fighting itself at somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes from first shot to the flag coming down, and the flag came down because a trooper climbed the pole and cut it loose. What followed the fighting went on longer. Tents inside and around the stockade were fired, prisoners were taken at the point of the bayonet, and men who had been nowhere near the enclosure were rounded up across the flat because they were on the ground and it was morning. The official death toll is 27. The majority of them were diggers. The exact figure has never been settled and never will be, because wounded men were carried away by their friends, and some of them died in tents and were buried by their friends, and because nobody on the government side was counting anyone but soldiers. Captain Henry Wise of the 40th Regiment was hit in the leg in the assault and died of the wound weeks later. Henry Ross, a Canadian digger who had been closely associated with the flag, was shot and died. The dead diggers were taken to the Ballarat Old Cemetery and put in the ground, and the dead soldiers were put in the ground a short distance away, and both plots are still there, facing each other across a path. Peter Lalore was shot in the left arm early in the fighting and went down behind the slabs, and men piled timber over him and left him there while the troopers went through the enclosure. He was got away afterwards, and the arm was amputated near the shoulder by a doctor working in a hut with no facilities to speak of, and he was hidden on the field and then out of it for months while the government advertised a reward for his capture. Nobody gave him up. On a field of tens of thousands of men, many of them destitute, with a reward posted, nobody gave him up. Martial law was proclaimed over the Ballarat district on the 4th of December and lifted on the 9th of December. Something over 100 prisoners had been taken. Most were released within days because there was nothing to charge them with, and the field was in a condition that made mass prosecution unwise. And the reaction that came back from Melbourne was not what the government had prepared for. Public meetings in the city condemned the attack. The press turned. Men who had no interest in the goldfields at all had watched a colonial administration send soldiers against unarmed and half-armed civilians over a license fee and had made up their minds about it. In the Crown law offices, they went ahead anyway and began drawing up charges against 13 of the men taken at the stockade. The charge was high treason. On conviction, the penalty was death. Chapter 8. The Acquittals and the Right. They came for the newspaper first. Henry Seacamp edited the Ballarat Times, and he had backed the Reform League and printed what he thought of the camp on the hill. And on the 4th of December, he was arrested. He was tried for seditious libel in January 1855, convicted, and sentenced to 6 months, of which he served about half before public pressure got him out. While he was inside, his wife Clara edited the paper and kept it printing, which made her one of the first women to run a newspaper in the colony. The treason trials began in Melbourne in February 1855. The first man in the dock was John Joseph, an African-American digger from New York. The Crown put its case, the jury retired, and it came back with an acquittal, and the crowd outside the Supreme Court carried Joseph through the streets of Melbourne in a chair. The government tried to have the remaining trials suspended and failed. One after another, the cases went to juries, and one after another, the juries acquitted. Raffaello Carboni was among them. By the end of March 1855, all 13 men had walked free, and there was not a jury in Victoria that was going to hang a digger for standing behind a slab fence. Hotham had already appointed a Goldfields Commission of Inquiry, and it reported in March 1855, and what it recommended was, in substance, what the diggers had asked for. The monthly licence was abolished. In its place came the miner's right, an annual document costing £1, and it did two things the licence had never done. It gave the holder the right to dig and to hold ground, and it gave him a vote. The revenue the government had been chasing was replaced by an export duty on gold, levied on what was actually taken out, which is the arrangement that should have existed in 1851. Local courts were set up on the fields, elected by the miners, to settle claim disputes and set the size of claims according to the ground. The rest followed, though not all of it at once. In 1856, Victoria introduced voting by secret ballot, an innovation so effective that when the rest of the world came round to it, it was known for decades as the Australian ballot. In 1857, the property qualification for members of the Legislative Assembly was abolished, so that a man without land could stand, and universal adult male suffrage arrived for Assembly elections. Payment of members, the fourth of the demands sworn to on Bakery Hill, and the one that decided whether a working man could actually afford to serve once elected, did not come until 1870. 3 of the 4 points were law inside 3 years. The fourth took 16. In 1856, Peter Lalor was elected to the Victorian Legislative Assembly. He served for most of the next 30 years, held ministerial office, and from 1880 to 1887 sat as Speaker of the House, which is to say that a man the government had put a price on for treason ended up running its parliament with one sleeve pinned up. He also, in later life, took positions on land and labour that disappointed a good many of the men who had knelt on Bakery Hill with him. John Basson Humphrey was elected as well, served as Minister of Mines, and died in Ballarat in 1891, with very little to his name. And here is the other half of that Parliament's record, and it belongs in the same chapter. In 1855, the year of the Acquittals, the Victorian legislature passed an act imposing a poll tax of £10 on every Chinese person landed in the colony, and limiting shipmasters to 1 Chinese passenger for every 10 tons of their vessel's burden. The response was that ships put their passengers ashore at Geechin Bay, near Robey in South Australia, and something in the order of tens of thousands of men walked overland from there to the Victorian diggings, a journey of several hundred kilometres, in parties led by guides. A residence tax followed. At the Buckland River in 1857, a mob of European diggers drove the Chinese population off the field, burned the camp and looted it, and the men responsible were substantially unpunished. Ballarat had a large Chinese camp on the flat below Golden Point, and the Ballarat Old Cemetery has a Chinese section in it, and the men who had sworn to defend their rights and liberties got the vote in 1855 and used it in a parliament that charged a man £10 for landing with a Chinese face. While all of this was going on, the ground had gone on quietly doing what it had always done, and the shafts had gone on, getting deeper. Chapter 9, The Companies. By the second half of the 1850s, the shallow leads at Ballarat were worked out, and the field was following the buried channels down and out under the basalt, and that was work an 8-foot claim and a windlass could not do. It needed steam. It needed pumping engines running day and night to keep the water below the working level, winding engines to lift the dirt, ventilation to move air along drives that ran hundreds of yards from the shaft, and it needed all of it financed before any gold appeared. The mining boards, elected under the reforms, enlarged the claim sizes to suit, because the ground demanded scale, and the parties became companies with shares quoted and traded. Ballarat had a stock exchange of its own for them, at the corner of Sturt and Lydiard, and between 1887 and 1889, it built the mining exchange further up Lydiard Street to house the trade properly. The men who knew how to do this work were brought from the other side of the planet. Cornwall had been sinking deep wet shafts after tin and copper for centuries, and its mines were failing, so Cornish miners came to Victoria in numbers and brought their engines, their timbering, their vocabulary, and their chapels with them. Ballarat sank shafts of 300 feet, then 500, then past 1,000, chasing gutters that ran on beneath the plain, and it kept producing when the shallow fields around it had nothing left. Through the middle of the 1850s, Victoria was turning out something on the order of 1/3 of the world's gold, and Ballarat was the richest single field in it. That money came up out of the shafts and went straight into stone. Ballarat West had been laid out on a formal grid on the higher ground away from the diggings, with streets of a width that made no sense for a mining camp and perfect sense for a city that intended to exist in 50 years. Sturt Street was set out about 100 metres across, with a planted reserve running down the middle of it. Lydiard Street, running north from it over the ground where the government camp had stood, filled up with the institutions of a place that had decided it was permanent. The railway station in 1862, when the line came up from Geelong. Craig's Royal Hotel, Her Majesty's Theatre in 1875, still standing and still in use. The Ballarat Fine Art Gallery in 1884, the first and largest regional gallery in the country. The town hall went up on Sturt Street in the early 1870s with a clock tower on it. Eulay's reed swamp was dug out, filled, and turned into Lake Wendouree, with botanical gardens along the western shore. Imagine standing on Sturt Street on a Saturday evening in 1888. The street is 100 metres wide, and the gas is lit down both sides of it and along the central plantation. A horse tram comes down the middle on rails laid the year before, the driver's bell going at the crossings. The town hall clock stands over the intersection, and the banks and the insurance offices run away east and west in Renaissance revival stone, arcaded, pedimented, corniced. 2 blocks north on Lydiard Street the theatre is filling, and beside it the walls of the new mining exchange are going up on foundations laid the summer before for companies working ground 400 feet under the eastern suburbs. The air smells of coal smoke, horses, and stone dust, and every pound of the stone in that street came up a rope in a bucket, out of the drowned bed of a river that stopped running before there was anybody here to watch it go. The ground was still taking its share. On the 12th of December 1882, at the new Australasian mine at Creswick, a few miles north of Ballarat, on the same system of buried leads, water broke into the workings from an old abandoned mine alongside. 27 men were in the drives below. Rescuers worked for days through mud and dark and rising water to reach them, and brought 5 out alive. 22 men died down there. It was the worst gold mining disaster in Australian history, and it happened for the oldest reason in deep lead mining, which is that nobody had a reliable map of what was already under the ground. The largest single piece of gold ever taken out of Ballarat had come up more than 20 years before that, out of a much shallower hole, on a piece of ground where 10,000 men had once stood in the open with their hats in their hands. Chapter 10. Bakery Hill. On the morning of the 9th of June 1858, a party of 22 Cornish miners were working a claim held by the Red Hill Mining Company on the eastern side of Ballarat, in a tunnel driven at a depth of 55 metres, 180 feet below the surface. The ground above them was Bakery Hill. One of them, working the face by candlelight, saw metal in the roof of the drive. What they cut out of it over the hours that followed weighed 2,217 troy ounces and 16 pennyweight, which is 68.98 kilograms. It was roughly the shape of a horse's head, about 49 centimetres long, and it was so far outside the ordinary run of finds that the party had to work out how to get it up the shaft at all. They called it the Welcome. It remains, more than a century and a half later, the second largest gold nugget ever found anywhere on Earth. And the only one that has ever beaten it is the Welcome Stranger, turned up by 2 men with a pick just under the grass at Molyagle in 1869, 100 kilometres to the north and not at Ballarat at all. The Welcome was carted into town and put on public display, and men queued in Sturt Street to look at it. It went to Melbourne. It was sold for a sum usually given as around £10,500 and shipped to England, where it was exhibited at the Crystal Palace to crowds who had never seen a colonial goldfield and never would. Then the Royal Mint melted it down and struck it into sovereigns. And the sovereigns went into circulation and were spent, and there is nothing left of the second largest nugget in the world except plaster replicas, an engraving, and a set of dimensions written down by the men who weighed it. The ground was finite, and everybody knew it. Every year the shafts went deeper, the drives ran further from the shaft, the pumping bills rose, and the yield per ton fell, and one by one the companies stopped. By the years around the First World War, the great deep mines of Ballarat East were shutting, and by the 1920s the era was effectively over. The difference between Ballarat and the fields around it was that the deep leads had held out for 60 years instead of 6. And 60 years is long enough to build a city that does not need the mine. Ballarat had foundries, engineering works, woolen mills, a railway, a hinterland of farms, a cathedral, and 2 of everything else. The shallow fields did not get that. A great many of them are a chimney in a paddock, a line of exotic trees where a street was, and a cemetery. The city has spent the century since then living on top of the evidence. Sovereign Hill opened in 1970 on the site of old workings on the southern edge of town. A full-scale reconstruction of the 1850s diggings with a puddling machine and a mine you can walk into. And it is one of the most visited places in regional Australia. The Eureka flag is in Ballarat in a controlled room, and it is not whole. Pieces were cut out of it for souvenirs over the decades it spent in private hands. So what survives is a torn blue field with the cross and the stars, and a great deal missing. The Stockade site is a park with a memorial in it. In the old cemetery, the diggers' graves and the soldiers' graves still face each other. And every so often, in Ballarat East, the ground above a forgotten shaft settles a little under somebody's yard or somebody's road, because the mines were mapped badly or not at all, and the timber that was holding them open has had 150 years to rot. Bakery Hill is a rise at a road junction on the eastern side of the city with a flagpole on it and a plaque at the foot of the pole. It is a slope you would walk over without registering the gradient, past a shop front and a set of traffic lights. There is nothing on it now, and there was nothing on it then. Under it, the drive where the 22 Cornishmen worked is still there at 180 feet, standing full of water that came back the moment the pump stopped and has not moved since, dark and cold and level, with the roof of the tunnel above it and the hole in the roof where they cut the thing out. Above that, on the surface, the plane trees along the middle of Sturt Street come into leaf every spring, and in the late afternoon the light comes down between them onto curbstones of grey basalt, quarried out of the same lava that buried the rivers in the first place.